Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be presenting this webinar today. I'd like to begin with acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners and true sovereigns of the land now known as Darebin, which is where I'm based in Melbourne. I acknowledge their creator spirit Bunjil, their ancestors and their elders, and I recognise their long and continuing connection to country and celebrate their rich cultural identity. And I encourage you to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which you're joining us from today in the chat. Another thing I just wanted to mention, and it's pretty exciting to be able to see so many people from New Zealand, Australia joining us today. It's awesome. Thank you for being here. Quick disclaimer, I did want to say that I'm not a lawyer and the information in this webinar isn't legal advice. It can be a sensitive topic, I guess. The lines blurred between employees and volunteers. So the information that I'm providing is from my experience in around 20 years or so in the volunteering sector. And over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working as a consultant specifically around volunteer engagement. So I've seen a lot. So yeah, I hope that today's session will be helpful for you. So, all right. So why does defining the relationship matter? Why do we need to define what volunteers are in an organisation or who the roles that they play versus employees? So to start with, there's legal compliance. So there are employment laws protecting workers' rights, so regarding wages, hours, benefits, safety, all of those kinds of things. And if a volunteer is performing duties similar to an employee without proper classification, so the lines are blurred between whether they're an employee or volunteer, the organisation can face legal consequences such as tax issues, risk of lawsuits or penalties, unpaid wages or benefits. So that if there's a volunteer that's able to demonstrate that actually they're doing the role of an employee, then the organisation might need to pay them unpaid wages and benefits. So then we've got insurance and liability. So employees and volunteers are typically covered under different insurance policies. And for employees, there's workers' compensation, which volunteers aren't covered by. And with volunteers, they may need separate public liability, and typically they also need volunteer workers insurance. Obviously, I'm based in Melbourne, and so I know about Australian laws impacting volunteers, and at the end I'll give you some direction around who to have a really good understanding of the legal side within your country as well, because it can differ. So misclassification around insurance can leave gaps in coverage, and it can expose both the individuals and the organisation as well as the community the volunteers are supporting. And then we've got fairness and expectations. So having clear role definitions helps set realistic expectations. So volunteers know what's expected of them, what support they'll receive, who's going to support them as well as a volunteer, and employees understand their responsibilities as well as the boundaries. So what can happen is sometimes there can be some role creep, and if employees perhaps don't know the boundaries of a role, they can ask volunteers to take on responsibilities that are actually out of scope of their role. So having these roles defined helps reduce the risk of burnout, overcommitment, and role conflict as well, and conflicts between volunteers and employees. So then we've also got risk mitigation and reputation. So if there are volunteers who are doing roles where that definition isn't clear between volunteers and employees, the organisation can face public scrutiny, and there can be ambiguity in the roles, which can lead to internal conflict, and there can be there's a risk of damage for the reputation of the organisation as well if there's any issues that arise. And lastly, we've got program effectiveness. So if the roles are defined, then it leads to better training and support, clear reporting lines, and stronger collaboration between employees and volunteers. Best practices for mitigating legal risks. Um, so some of these I am going to go into more detail later on in the webinar. The first one is around defining the roles and expectations. So having clear role descriptions for both volunteers and employees. Often, this is something that I practice, is having, language matters. So having position descriptions for employees, and for volunteers, it can be volunteer role descriptions. And within those role descriptions, position descriptions for employees, being really clear on what the tasks are, the responsibilities, and the boundaries of roles to avoid overlap and role creep. And it also helps clarify expectations if there's grievances. So if a volunteer is performing tasks that are outside of their role, it helps manage those grievances as well. So then we've got including the right people in the role development. So developing a new volunteer role, for example. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but essentially involving those impacted by the role in its design is good practice. It supports smoother change management. So say an organisation is looking at developing a new volunteer role, by including all of those people, all those stakeholder groups that are impacted by that potential role, it will support change management by increasing buy-in. Another thing to mention is that depending on what your organisation is, that you might want to consider trade unions as well, and whether they need to be consulted with or considered in the role development, if they have, if that's something that may come up in your organisation. Then we've got developing a volunteer agreement. So I'm going to go through this a bit more detail a little bit later. But one of the key things is using language that avoids implying employment in your volunteer agreement, and in a volunteer agreement, outlining expectations, rights, and limitations as well. Okay, then providing training, awareness, and support. So this is down to educating employees and volunteers on role distinctions, and providing guidance on what volunteers can and cannot do. I'll talk a little bit later about training as well, but that's kind of good practice so that it's really clear what a volunteer's role is, and versus an employee's. And this is something that I see a lot of, where employees aren't, in big organisations in particular, aren't really clear on what the tasks the volunteers are doing. And like I mentioned before, it can happen where an employee or employees ask volunteers to take on some extra responsibilities which are actually out of scope of their role, and that can create, some blurring of lines. Then recognising contributions equitably, so celebrating the efforts and contributions of both volunteers and employees. So with volunteers, there's many things that you can do to recognise volunteers. Non-monetary recognition, such as events. It can be recognising years of service and special achievements. Everything from providing them with name tags makes them, helps feel like they're a valued part of the team. Having, you might have a T-shirt or some kind of branded uniform, but having it clear that they are a volunteer is really helpful as well, so that they don't get confused with staff as well. So just having some distinctions there. Other ways of recognising volunteers, consulting with regarding decisions which impact them, and developing mentor roles as well. So I've got a blog that is all about recognition and that kind of thing. Um, Creating feedback channels, so setting up forums for both volunteers and employees to be able to share feedback. So whether there is a particular volunteer role being developed, that sort of thing, so that employees and volunteers have an avenue to raise any feedback, concerns, that side of things. And having those feedback channels encourages a collaborative and inclusive culture within the organisation. Another thing is avoiding payments. So, outside of reimbursements, of course. So, out of pocket expenses. So, and with reimbursements, having documenting what will and won't be reimbursed for volunteers and having a process around that as well. So, it's really clear for volunteers that if your organisation, hopefully, they support reimbursement for out of pocket expenses, what is the process that they need to follow? And where possible, avoiding paying honorariums, stipends, things like that. And if that is something that your organisation does, I would recommend getting some legal advice on it. So I have, as a consultant, done some work with an organisation who, for those in Australia, I did a gap analysis against the national standards, and it was very unclear um, that a particular group of volunteers were actually volunteers, because reading their role descriptions, it was unclear. Volunteer wasn't mentioned anywhere in there, and they were also getting paid an honorarium as well. So I was able to give them some advice on that. So then we've got audits and compliance. So keeping volunteer policies and processes, role descriptions, grievance procedures, etc. Um, keeping them up to date, reviewing them, reviewing your volunteer roles, and updating policies to reflect changes in workplace regulations as well as organisational needs which change. And also periodically getting policies or engaging legal advisors where necessary. So if you are introducing a new role, or if you're unsure of if the distinction between a volunteer role and employees is unclear, I'd recommend getting some legal advice. And having the compliance audit side of things ensures compliance and reduces risk as well. And also, if possible, avoid assigning duties that resemble paid work or create dependency as well. And I know that can be challenging, particularly for uh, organisations which are almost volunteer, completely volunteer run. So my advice in those situations, say an organisation is volunteer run and then introduces one of those volunteers becomes a paid staff member, making sure that the distinction between the roles is really clear by following the guidance here. So then we've also got maintaining records. So having a volunteer management system such as Better Impact, which you can track everything from, volunteer roles, recruitment processes, hours, impact, agreements, compliance, for example, police checks, um, and training as well, helps protect the organisation in case there is any legal issues, because it's, you've got a record of volunteer contributions. And then, of course, we've got insurance coverage. So making sure you've got the appropriate insurance for volunteers, whether it's public liability, volunteer workers insurance, and in communicating with volunteers what insurance they are covered by, and if there's any restrictions. Often there is restrictions around, or if things may change depending on age limits, just so it's really clear on them, and also for them to understand that if they go outside the scope of their role, that they may not be covered by insurance as well. and ensuring employees remain under workers' compensation schemes. I'm going to talk a little bit about a stakeholder analysis. And the reason I am doing that is because, say, we're developing a new volunteer role. This is one of the things that I recommend doing. So, but also understanding how to do a stakeholder analysis is a really useful tool, not just for new role development, but also if there's a change happening within your organization, it's really good to um, conduct a stakeholder analysis to make sure that the right people are included in communication around and involvement around that change as well. So a few of the benefits when developing a new volunteer role. So it helps clarify expectations and boundaries of the role by identifying who's impacted by or involved in the potential role. It ensures all parties understand the scope of the volunteer role. It can also mean that if there's differing expectations between different stakeholders, that those you know, can be brought to the surface early on, and it reduces confusion and conflict. Helps define clear boundaries between volunteer and employee responsibilities, and helps prevent role creep or overlap with employee duties, and reduces the risk of misclassification by aligning expectations early. By conducting a stakeholder analysis, it also helps improve the role design and alignment. So, incorporating insights from those directly impacted, so whether it's volunteers or particular volunteers in a particular group, supervisors, HR, program managers, etc., it ensures the role aligns with and supports organisational and goals and program needs, and provides an opportunity to tailor communication and involvement. So once you've identified the different stakeholders, there's a good chance that the communication involvement that goes out to, say, a group of volunteers will be different from the communication that goes out to different employee groups, for example. Um, It also means that volunteer contributions are aligned with employee workflows and service delivery. So, if a particular employee stakeholder group isn't involved or isn't identified and included in the role development, then it can mean that you know these things aren't employee workflow isn't considered, for example. Then it also encourages co-design with those who will supervise or support the role, um, and helps with making informed decisions, which enhance role clarity and purpose, and also boosts volunteer engagement. So if you're including the volunteers in that role development or certain groups of volunteers, that will help with volunteer engagement. Another benefit of doing a stakeholder analysis is strengthening legal and operational compliance. So, potentially bringing HR or legal early on into planning. It can help identify any potential legal risks before implementation of this new role. And it can also, so for example, potential misclassification risks or any policy gaps, that side of things, and ensuring the role complies with employment laws and sector specific regulations. And it can also support documentation and audit readiness, because in a minute I'll kind of go through what kind of things to include in a stakeholder analysis. And, having that documented helps as well. Show your case that this is a volunteer role and what's being considered in the development. Also helps build buy-in and collaboration. So building trust and transparency across different departments, and between volunteers and employees. And it encourages collaboration across different program teams, and different, employee groups, volunteer groups. And importantly, it also fosters a culture of shared responsibility for volunteer success. It's not just up to a volunteer coordinator or volunteer manager to make this volunteer role a success, but having the right people involved, whoever they are in the organisation, then they can see that it's actually they play a part in being responsible for the role's success as well, and volunteer retention. And then it also supports sustainable volunteer management. So by identifying what training is going to be required, what supervision, what support, what are the resource needs? Because again, if the right people aren't involved in those, in that role development, then things can get missed. There may be specific training that needs to be covered that's not included because whoever stakeholders haven't been included in that role development. It also anticipates change management or any communication challenges that may come up, identifies resource gaps or operational dependencies, and enables proactive planning for onboarding and retention. Okay, so how do we go about conducting a stakeholder analysis? So first thing, so with volunteer role development, I would recommend to define the purpose of the role. How is that role going to support the organisation's goals, mission? Who's it going to benefit? All of those kinds of things, but being really clear before, at the very first start of conducting a stakeholder analysis, really understanding that. So then after that, we want to look at, under the purpose of the role, we also want to clarify why the new volunteer role is needed. So what's the objectives of it, and what's the expected impact on the organisation, the volunteers, the community by having that new role. Then we broadly want to look at identifying stakeholders. So these can be individuals, and they could also be stakeholder groups as well. So even just first of all doing just a brain dump, and having a think who's impacted, what is their role and their connection to this potential new role. So looking at, okay, what are the benefits, who benefits from the role? And that could be community members, it could be employees, who is influenced by the potential role. Again, it could be trade unions, so you need having a think about that. Also thinking about different employee groups, and who's going to support or resource the role as well, and who's affected. So it could be, specific volunteer groups, employees, and you can have a think about as well internal groups and external groups as well that may need to be considered. Then after kind of doing a bit of a brainstorm and figuring out who are potential stakeholders for this new role development, then it's creating a matrix really. So looking at, and you can do this just by having an Excel doc, Word doc, which just has who the stakeholder group or stakeholder, their role and connection, what are the benefits of involving that stakeholder or stakeholder groups in the development of this role. So for example, it could be experience and insight on, that a particular stakeholder group may be able to provide. Then we also want to look at interests. So with that particular stakeholder, how much do they care about the role? And you can do a simple like grading system. It can just be, low, medium, high. And then we also want to look at influence. So with each of the stakeholder groups, how much influence do they have over its success? So again, having a bit of think about, so, CEO may have, high, uh, you know, big influence, whereas, some other groups or employees may not have so much influence. So you want to consider that in your stakeholder analysis, because if they've got high influence, then, that'll what involvement they have and how you communicate and involve them can differ. And so with the influence as well, you want to have a think about, are we going to inform them about the volunteer role development or progress that's happening with the role development? Do we want to consult with them, which is kind of more involvement? Do we want to involve them in the actual development? And then we go down to even much more involvement, which is looking at collaboration and empowerment. So many times from my experience, it's a lot about certain groups may just need to be informed, or stakeholders, and there may be quite a few important groups which need to be consulted with, and then also some others being involved more in the development. And we also want to have a look at what potential impact each of the stakeholder groups have. So, in regards to the proposed new role, so having a think about what benefits or challenges will the role bring to each stakeholder group. Are there any risks involved? So if there's a particular employee group that this new volunteer role will have a big impact on their workflow, having a think about those kind of things. And again, you can do just like a simple grading, low, medium, high as well. So after you've done that, then really, because that'll kind of make it really clear about who needs to be involved, what involvement they need to have, and then we can have a bit of a think about the engagement strategies and how we're going to engage with each of those different stakeholder groups. So, for example, if someone has a high level of influence and high interest, then involving them in the planning stage may be beneficial. But if someone has low influence, low interest, low impact, you might just look at informing them in in the employee newsletter or something like that, just to let them know that the role is being developed. So after that, the next steps after kind of conducting that stakeholder mapping, stakeholder analysis, is looking at the engagement strategies, and then also documenting as well. So just by creating this stakeholder mapping exercise, that is, documenting that and communicating the findings with the different stakeholder groups. So that all of these things are just starting to build on and support change management as well. So being really clear around particular stakeholder groups, so they can understand, okay, I'm going to be consulted with around this development, or I'm going to be included in a workshop, those kinds of things as well.
What is your view on if VC manager should in large organizations be part of HR team or not?
Oh, that's a good question. I've seen it happen in organizations. I've seen volunteer coordinators in all different kinds of departments. Look, I do think it's a good idea having under, people and culture, because often, from my experience, it helps um, advocate for the volunteers, because then often volunteers are kind of included in a lot of the decisions and events and things. It helps make volunteers more considered, I guess. So I've been in departments when I worked as a volunteer manager where moved around from different departments, once in marketing, and then community, and then in people and culture, and it means that volunteer coordinator is included in a lot of meetings and things like that, which uh, helps, I guess, for a volunteer coordinator or volunteer manager to be able to say, hey, what about the volunteers? This is happening with the employees. Have you thought about how we can include volunteers in this as well? So, okay, so with role titles as well for developing role descriptions. So um, making sure it's clear, descriptive, and where possible, avoiding titles that would imply employment. So, for example, not having manager in a volunteer's title, and even coordinator as well, can be helpful. And if you can have volunteer in the title, that would be great. So also including the purpose of the role. So and this comes back to what I was talking about before when you're looking at developing a new role. Um, so, just one or two sentences which explains how the role supports the organisation's mission or goals, or goals. So this helps it really clear for volunteers to understand the why behind their contribution. How is their volunteer contribution supporting the organisation mission or goals? And one of the things to have a think about is if you do have volunteer roles that aren't directly supporting the organisation missions or goals, is that a volunteer role that is worth having in your organisation as well? Um, so then we've got supervision and support. So it's really clear in the role description for the volunteer who the volunteer can it will be supervised by, what kind of support and feedback will be provided to them, what kind of mechanisms are in place. Location and conditions. So this can be, is the role on site? Where is it on site? Is it remote? And, if there's any kind of specific requirements around the location as well. So then also key responsibilities. So having specific tasks that the volunteers are going to perform as part of that volunteer role. One of the tips here is around avoiding language that implies obligation as well. So or performance metrics as well. So if you can lean away from that in your role descriptions, it is helpful in defining that distinction between volunteers and employees. Time commitment. So if is the role going to be over a project based? Is it are there expectations at all around do they a shift a fortnight, that kind of thing, but also being really clear that there is flexibility as well, because the more you can kind of, and I know this is challenging, because a lot of organizations, to be able to support their rostering, they need to have volunteers at certain times, etc., to be able to support you know the dogs being walked at an animal shelter, for example. So, but I guess reinforcing that there's flexibility and what flexibility there is as well. And skills and attributes. So if there's any required or like essential or desired skills, experience required for the role, what the application process is, and any requirements, will they be required to have an interview? Benefits to the volunteers, so non-monetary benefits such as skill development, networking, those community impact, different things like that. Any recognition or appreciation practices that the organisation provides. Also recommend referring to the volunteer agreement reference. So, for example, you could put that under your you know key responsibilities, for example. Um, so mentioning that the role is governed by volunteer agreement, and also having a date of the last time the role description was reviewed, and the next, whether it's in 2 years' time, for example, that when the next review is, as well as a signature. So, including this information in role descriptions is really helpful with recruitment, as well as defining those different the between employees and volunteers. So, with recruitment, it means that a potential volunteer can read the information and be really clear upfront. Okay, this is what is asked of the role. These are my responsibilities. This is where it's location, etc. Yeah, that sounds like a good fit for me and I can apply. And if it doesn't sound like a good fit for them, then they won't apply. And it also means, saving their time and saving your time for, volunteers potentially applying for roles that they're not a good fit for.
The first one is, what about people who are sometimes paid as a contractor and sometimes volunteer their time?
That is a tricky one. So again, I would be, you know, are they being paid hopefully for a different role? Is it being really clear around, okay, when they're volunteering, this is the role description for them? Um, and if there are certain, times that they're a contractor, um, having a different, position description for them as well, because this is tricky because it could, yeah, create blurring of lines, and it can be confusing for the volunteer slash employee, as well as everyone they work with as well. So I think, being really clear around what's the role that they're doing. Like, you don't want to be in a position where there is an individual who is uh, sometimes doing the same responsibilities, and sometimes they're getting paid for it and sometimes they're not, because that just can create all sorts of ambiguity as well. So yeah. Is there another question, Paula?
Yes, there's another one. There is presently no hierarchy on our 500 plus volunteers, but given the size and what you mentioned about not having manager or coordinator titles, how would you recommend handling seniority or experience or leadership roles within large groups of volunteers, please?
Yeah. I missed the first part of that, but I'm a big fan of like mentor volunteer roles, and having those kind of leadership roles for volunteers, because it creates an opportunity for volunteers to learn, enhance new skills. So I think it's really important, though, if you are going down this path, to have a separate role description. How is the mentor or senior role different to other volunteer roles? What are their responsibilities? So, for example, something that I've found works really well is having mentors who are involved, have it play a certain part in recruitment of volunteers. So they perhaps are involved in some of the interviews, like a part of the interview. They don't run the interview, that side of things, but also um, yeah, they're there to provide, I guess, their feedback and an opportunity for connection with new volunteers. Also, having them involved, or if they're happy to, in inductions as well. And again, there can be, say, there's a induction checklist. There might be a part of that the volunteer. Uh, mentor volunteer is involved in. Maybe it's meeting with them and giving them, a quick tour, showing them where the bathrooms are, and then handing over to the volunteer coordinator or supervisor, that kind of thing. So being really clear around what their role is. The other thing is, I found it really important with those roles that those individuals are provided with specific training around what their role is, what the boundaries of their role are. So, what kind of challenges they may encounter and how to. So, say, for example, that there is a mentor volunteer supporting part of an induction, that they have training so that they know that each of those mentor volunteers is providing the same kind of information um, that you're wanting them to provide. Okay, so developing a volunteer agreement. So um, this is, yeah, it's really important in a volunteer agreement to avoid language that implies an employment relationship. So, a well drafted volunteer agreement sets expectations when clarifying the volunteer role is unpaid, that participation is voluntary and can be ended by either party at any point, and that the agreement does not create an employment relationship as well. So, and you can have, yeah, a statement around that as well. Um, so clarifying, that it's that volunteer role, that they're, not covered under employment law. Um, Also referring to the volunteer role description, or volunteer role descriptions as well. Um, and also including there around, so with time commitment and flexibility, again emphasizing flexibility, because the more kind of you can demonstrate that the volunteer role, it's not mandated, I guess, that there is that flexibility around catering to that volunteer's needs, but also that it isn't, it then kind of moves a bit away from being an employee relationship towards more being a volunteer relationship, because there is that flexibility. Um, and yeah, so avoiding language that implies obligation or performance metrics, that kind of thing. Um, but still at the same time, kind of outlining expectations as well, um, or maybe expectation. Yeah. Um, Emphasizing that flexibility. Supervision and support. And I know there is a bit of a crossover between kind of what's in the role description and what's in a volunteer agreement, but it is, it's important to have in both. Um, Again, who's going to be supporting the role, what kind of guidance they're going to be having, and confidentiality and conduct. So this is around, workforce. So whether it's volunteers and employees, what are the expectations around things like privacy, safety, respectful behaviour as well. And optional, you might want to include in your volunteer agreement some of the or refer to some of the policies that volunteers um, are required to follow as well. So if there's a volunteer policy, for example. Insurance and liability. So clarify whether the volunteer is covered by insurance, what insurance they're covered by, and if there's any areas that they're not covered by as well. And again, having a signature and a date, both for and including space for both volunteer and an organisational representative to sign. So that also kind of reinforces that mutual understanding around the documentation. Um, Training and support tips. So I'm just going to quickly go through this because I've just realised the time. So with training for volunteers and employees, making sure that there's an induction, things like safety obligations, organisational policies are covered. Um, you know, Information about the volunteer agreement and role boundaries, also providing ongoing training. So whether it's refresher training, because processes change, and as well as, giving them opportunities for upskilling as well. Buddy shifts provide those mentoring opportunities for new volunteers to learn from experienced volunteers. So with mentor roles, that's another really valuable opportunity for new volunteers to be matched up with experienced volunteers and build not only their skills, but also building their connection with the organisation, which can help with retention as well. So, and then supervision. So, providing opportunities for volunteers to debrief, provide questions or ask questions and attend meetings. Improvement opportunities. So, in regards to defining the relationship, so reviewing regularly, every couple of years, for example, reviewing role descriptions, volunteer agreement policies, training, onboarding process, for example, consulting with volunteers and employees when reviewing documentation. So I found it's really helpful when reviewing role descriptions actually to involve volunteers who do that role and say, this is a role description. Is there anything else that, is perhaps not on there or that we need to consider? Um, Observing and participating. So this can be really helpful is actually doing like a day in the life of a volunteer, or it could be a shift of a volunteer. So spending a few hours actually side by side with a volunteer, seeing the challenges and experiences that they go through as well, and making sure that helps you then also understand, is everything covered in the role description, as well as kind of um, opens your eyes and makes you aware of things that perhaps when you're a bit removed from, that you aren't aware of. And seeking legal advice. So, if in doubt, seek advice from legal advisors. So, role development, or if you're reviewing an existing role and you're not sure, does this cross? Is this, are the lines a bit blurred here? Then, yeah, looking at legal advice. So, um, legal obligations vary obviously from country and jurisdiction. So I've just recommend that wherever you are in the world, that you check in with peak bodies. So in Australia, Volunteering Australia, Justice Connect, not-for-profit law, they collaborated and have you know a really good guide as well around volunteer management. And then you've got your state peak bodies such as Volunteering Victoria. I've put a few other suggestions in there for other countries as well. And yes, that is the end of my presentation. So thank you, everyone. Bye.